their labor services. Okay, now this being said, demand is determined by the organizations and supply is determined by the individuals themselves who are willing to work, right? Okay, now to represent the demand side, we have demand curve for labor, right? To to you know, to determine how much is the demand for labor, that is on the basis of the labor demand curve that we have talked about, but I'll give you quick recap in today's class. And what is, how is supply represented? Supply is represented through supply of labor curve, which is determined by the individuals, right? Now think about this. We did quite a detailed discussion as to what is demand for labor, right? So we said that demand for labor is basically its marginal revenue product of labor. What is demand for labor? Demand for labor for by any firm, demand for labor by any firm is basically its marginal revenue product of labor. So how much revenue an employee generates for the company, that is the maximum wage that that company would be willing to pay to that person, right? Obviously, right? Why would you want to pay someone more than what the revenue they generate for the company, right? So demand for labor by any firm, single firm, one organization, is based on the marginal revenue product of labor that any employee generates for the company. So that's the first thing that we discussed. Then we said, when we talked about the market demand for labor, now obviously in market there are a couple of firms, there are a number of firms who want to hire a certain type of labor. Market demand for labor is basically made up of right? It's made up of all the individual firms who want to hire labor, right? So think about this. If we take a very simple example of teachers, right? So for teachers, all schools, all online teaching platforms who are willing to hire teachers will determine collectively the market demand for teachers, right? Which we'll talk about more in today's class. Similarly, if you think about the market demand for doctors, that will comprise of the entire demand of doctors by all the different organizations, like all the hospitals, all the clinics, you know, all these organizations who want to hire doctors, right? So market demand curve is basically sum of individual firms demand for labor. Sum of individual firms demand for labor. Does it make sense? Right? So when you add those individual demand curves, individual firms demand curves, that will give you the market demand for labor. Any confusion so far? Right? We've already talked about this. Then when we come to the supply side, right? So on the supply side, again, we looked at two types of supply curves, labor supply, two types of labor supply curves. So there is individual labor supply, and then there's individual labor supply curve, and then there's market labor supply curve. Right? So one is individual labor supply curve and the other one is market labor supply curve. Okay, now what's the difference between the two? So the difference is very simple, that individual supply of labor is only showing the supply of one individual. How many, right, we can do that, but this is everything we have already written it down on the notes, right? So that will be kind of repetition. That's why I'm not writing it, but all the new part that we'll do today, I'll write it on the notes. I have that document open, right? Okay, now the market's labor supply is again sum of individual supply curve, right? So if you think of teachers labor supply, so teachers supply of labor would be sum of all the teachers who are available in a certain market. Let's say Pakistan is a market, then all people who are eligible and qualified to work as teachers in Pakistan would collectively determine the supply of teachers in Pakistan. Similarly for other countries, right? So market supply of labor is sum of individual supply curves. Sum of, and we also talked about in our last classes how to do that. Sum of individual labor supply curves. Sum of individual labor, sum of individual labor supply curves. Any confusion so far? Right, we good on this? Okay, now this being said, we'll move on and today we'll talk about perfect labor markets, right? Now what is perfect labor market? Today we'll talk about a couple of different things, but first of all, we have to start a discussion about what are perfect labor markets, and then we move forward from there, and we'll discuss imperfect labor markets and a couple of other topics like so on and so forth. Perfect labor market. But before that, I think we could not complete our discussion about wage determination, right? So before this, we will talk about what is wage determination. Let me share my screen with you, right? Okay, now think about this. Just give me a second. Labor market. Okay, have a look at this. Now, how are wages determined in the market? That's something, yes, we had to do wage determination. So how are wages determined in the market? That's what we'll talk about first, and then move on and talk about perfect labor markets, right? Okay, now wage determination is the process, just like we know that in product markets, it's called price determination. So just like prices are determined in the product markets, wages determined in labor markets. What is wage determination? Right, based on forces of labor demand and supply. Now think about this. Let's read this definition together. What is wage determination? So wage determination is the process by which wages of different occupations. Now, what are occupations? So think about it. Teaching is an occupation. Medical profession, like medical occupation, right? Being a doctor is an occupation. Lawyer is an occupation. Engineer is an occupation, right? And all these different type of skills that you develop to do job in a certain industry, that is an occupation, right? Are determined in the market based on market forces of labor demand and labor supply. So just like in product markets, where the price of a product is determined on the market forces of demand for the good and supply for the good. Similarly, in the labor market, you'll see that the wages are based on the market supply of labor and market demand for labor, right? So you have wages on the y-axis, and then you have quantity of labor on the x-axis, right? So you have quantity of labor on the x-axis and wages on the y-axis. Now, where the demand and supply of labor will intersect, right? Now, we already know that demand for labor is downward sloping, right? And supply of labor is upward sloping. So where the supply and demand in the market, not individual, right? This is a very important thing. Market, labor supply, right? And market labor demand, right? So which is for the entire market. This is very important to remember, right? So I'll tell you in a bit. Just give me a second. Market labor demand. So what is the total demand for labor in the market, right? That is shown by this downward sloping graph. So what is the total demand in the market for labor? That is shown by this downward sloping demand curve. And what is the total market market labor supply, which means that what is the total quantity of people who are willing to work at different wage rates. So technically, this is showing you the total quantity of people who are willing to work at different wage rates. So if I choose this point over here, A, and let's say if I choose then another point over here on the labor market supply, then what it actually shows us is the combination of the wages and the quantity of labor available at that wage rate, right? So if this wage is being paid to workers, that would be anything, let's say $15,000, $5,000 per month or whatever, right? So at $5,000 per month, how many people are willing to work? Let's say 100. Then if this increases to, let's say, anything higher than this, right? So let's say if this increases to then W2 at this wage rate, which is obviously higher than $5,000 per month, per week, whatever it is, right? Then let's say 150 people are willing to work at this wage rate. So that is what labor market supply shows, right? Okay, we good on this. Now, similarly, the market demand for labor shows how much is the total demand in the market for this type of occupation, right? So think about this. It will show you the same thing that if I choose any point on the demand curve, it will show us how much wage at certain wage rate, how much is the quantity that firms are demanding, how much is the quantity that firms are demanding. That is what it will show us, right? So you can choose any 2 points just to quickly tell you, right? So at this point, let's say on the demand curve, we label it as A, and then we label it as B. So point A will show you that if the prevailing wage rates in the market is, let's say anything W1, right? So how much quantity in total will be demanded by all these different organizations? Let's say 700 people. And if the wage rate drops anything further than W1, obviously now it's cheaper to hire people, cheaper to employ people. So therefore the demand for labor would increase from 700 to 800, right? So that is simply what it shows. Okay, now moving forward, just like with the product markets where the demand and supply of product determine its prices. In this case, where the labor supply and labor demand are equal, that will be the equilibrium point where the two intersect. And this equilibrium point will show you the equilibrium wages, which I'll tell you what that is exactly. And it will show you the equilibrium quantity. So equilibrium wage is basically the wage that is being paid to a typical worker in this occupation. So how much wage is being paid during a certain time period to that person who is working in this occupation. Let's say that turns out to be $6,000 per month, right? And how much quantity of this type of labor be hired in the market, right? So let's say 10,000 people. This could be for any occupation. This could be for, let's say, doctors, engineers, scientists, computer scientists, anything, right? So that is basically the market equilibrium in labor market, right? So this is labor market equilibrium, simply speaking, right? So let me write that down. Okay, is everything clear so far? Labor market equilibrium. Okay, now before we move any forward, let me tell you how this labor market equilibrium can change. Obviously, equilibrium is achieved at a certain point in time, but then a lot of other changes are taking place in the market because of which that equilibrium is disturbed and a new equilibrium is reached, right? So what factors would cause a change in equilibrium? That is what we are about to discuss. Okay, now think about this. Let's first go back, and we've already written this. Change in labor or labor supply, initial equilibrium